His fingers were still wrapped around her wrist when the man in the black coat stood up. No shouting, no warning, just one calm step forward, and suddenly the richest man in the room couldn't move his hands. That's when everyone realized this wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning, and it was only just beginning. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The rain hammered the windows of the Silver Spoon Diner. Oscar Gimenez, 43 years old and alert despite the late hour, sat motionless in the corner booth. The former enforcer turned mafia boss wasn't here for the coffee. He was here because old habits died hard, and watching a room had kept him alive for 20 years. That vigilance sharpened when George Cheney, dressed in tailored wool and entitlement, grabbed the waitress by the wrist. Her body went rigid. Other customers studied their plates. Oscar stood up. The neon sign outside bled crimson and blue through the rain-streaked glass, casting shadows across the worn vinyl booths. Oscar's black coffee sat cooling in front of him, untouched for the past 15 minutes. His tattooed fingers, ink that crawled up from his knuckles and disappeared into the cuffs of his dark coat, rested flat against the table. The serpent coiled around his neck was barely visible in the dim light, a reminder of decisions made and prices paid. He'd been watching the room with practiced detachment, the truck driver nursing coffee at the counter, the exhausted nurse 2 booths down, still in scrubs, the college kid pretending to study while fighting sleep, and the waitress Jennifer, according to her name tag, moving through the fluorescent space with careful efficiency. She was younger than Oscar had first thought. Late 20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back from a face that had learned not to show too much. Her yellow uniform was clean but worn at the seams, and she moved with the kind of precision that came from years of navigating tight spaces and demanding customers. Oscar had noticed her before during his late-night visits. The way she refilled cups without being asked. The way she thanked people even when they didn't deserve it. The way her shoulders tensed when certain types of men walked through the door. Men like George Cheney. He'd entered 10 minutes ago with the posture of someone who'd never waited for anything in his life. Mid-40s, slicked back hair going silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. The expensive cologne reached Oscar's booth before the man did, cutting through the smell of burnt coffee and fry grease. George had taken a booth near the window, spreading out like he owned the place. When Jennifer approached with the coffee pot, Oscar saw her body language shift, shoulders back, chin up, professional smile locked in place. "Just coffee," George had said, not looking at her. She'd poured, turned to leave. His hand shot out. "Not so fast, sweetheart." The grab was quick but deliberate. Fingers circling her wrist, thumb pressing into the soft flesh of her inner arm. Jennifer's free hand tightened on the coffee pot, her knuckles going white. Her professional smile flickered. "Sir, I need to... I'm talking to you." George's voice was low, intimate, the kind of quiet that demanded attention. "You've been ignoring me all night. That's not very friendly." Oscar's jaw tightened. The truck driver at the counter found something fascinating about his eggs. The nurse stared at her phone. The college kid hunched lower over his textbook. Jennifer's eyes darted around the room, looking for help that wasn't coming. "Sir, please let go." "When I'm ready." George leaned in, still holding her wrist. "You know what your problem is? No respect for customers who keep this dump in business." Oscar set his coffee cup down. The ceramic clinked against the saucer, sharp in the sudden silence. George glanced up, irritated. His eyes found Oscar, the tattoos, the long dark coat, the posture of someone who didn't need to puff up to fill space. For a moment, something flickered across George's face. Calculation, dismissal. He turned back to Jennifer. "As I was saying," the booth creaked as Oscar stood. He moved with deliberate calm, no rush, no theatrics. 3 decades in organized crime had taught him that real power never announced itself. It simply was. His footsteps were measured, unhurried. 6 steps to close the distance. George's grip on Jennifer's wrist tightened reflexively. Oscar stopped beside their booth, looking down at where George's fingers dug into Jennifer's skin. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Let her go. Not a request, not a threat. A statement of fact about what would happen next. George's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you. It does now." The air in the diner shifted. The truck driver's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The nurse's thumb hovered over her phone screen. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum with tension. Jennifer stood frozen, coffee pot trembling in her grip, caught between Oscar and George like a pawn between kings. George released her wrist with exaggerated slowness, making it clear the choice was his. Happy? Oscar said nothing. His dark eyes, calm, patient, and utterly uncompromising, stayed locked on George's face. Jennifer stepped back, rubbing her wrist. I'll get the manager. Don't. Oscar's gaze never left George. He's leaving. George laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. You have any idea who I am? No. George Chaney. I own half the commercial real estate in this district, including this building. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. So maybe you should think carefully about. Oscar moved. Not violently, not suddenly, with the fluid certainty of someone who'd made similar motions 1,000 times before. He reached out and took George's hands, both of them in his own grip. The hold looked almost gentle, two men shaking hands. But George's face drained of color as Oscar's fingers found pressure points, locking the joints in place. Oscar pulled George close, their faces inches apart. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a register only George could hear. Touch her again, and you'll learn what real consequences feel like. The intimacy of the moment was worse than any shove or shout. George's breath came fast, shallow. His eyes darted sideways, looking for witnesses, for help, for anything that might restore the balance of power. Oscar held him there for 3 more seconds, then released him. George stumbled back, catching himself against the booth. His hands shook as he smoothed his jacket. The expensive fabric suddenly looked wrong on him, like costume jewelry exposed under harsh light. You have no idea what you just... I know exactly. Oscar's voice remained steady, patient. Leave. George's mouth worked, forming words that wouldn't come. His face flushed red, then pale. Finally, he grabbed his coat and walked toward the door with as much dignity as he could salvage. At the threshold, he turned back. This isn't over, the door chimed as he left, rain swallowing him into the neon-soaked night. Oscar returned to his booth as if nothing had happened, sat down, picked up his coffee. The diner exhaled collectively. The truck driver resumed eating. The nurse went back to her phone. Normal sounds filtered back: the hiss of the grill, the clink of dishes, the relentless drumming of rain. Jennifer stood by George's abandoned booth, still rubbing her wrist, staring at Oscar with an expression caught between gratitude and fear. She didn't know whether she'd just been saved or caught in something worse. Oscar met her eyes briefly, gave a single nod, then returned his attention to his coffee. Outside, the rain continued. The neon lights bled their colors into the darkness, and somewhere in the wet streets beyond, George Chaney was already planning his response. Oscar Gimenez had killed his first man at 19. The memory sat in his mind like a photograph. He couldn't discard the weight of the gun, the sound it made, the way the body fell. Not the dramatized violence of movies, but the quiet, irreversible finality of it. He'd thrown up afterward in an alley, hands shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. 24 years later, sitting in the Silver Spoon diner with cold coffee and rain-streaked windows, he could still feel the ghost of that shake in his fingers. He'd learned something that night in the alley. Violence was easy. Control was hard. The diner had returned to its illusion of normalcy. Dishes clinked. The grill hissed. The truck driver paid his check and left without making eye contact, but Oscar could feel the residual tension in the air, the way prey animals sense a predator even after it stops moving. Jennifer stood near the coffee station, pretending to organize sugar packets while stealing glances at him. Her hands moved mechanically: straighten, stack, straighten, stack, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Oscar understood the look. He'd seen it before in different contexts, different faces. The uncertainty of someone trying to calculate whether they'd been saved or simply witnessed something they shouldn't have. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitter cold slide down his throat. The taste matched his mood: acrid, unsatisfying, necessary. Control the chaos, or the chaos controls you. His uncle Raphael had taught him that. Not in some dramatic moment, but over breakfast in a kitchen that smelled like cigarettes and espresso. Raphael, who'd run 3 neighborhoods with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, who died in his sleep at 73 with a rosary in his hands and every debt settled. Violence is a tool, Oscar, like a hammer. You use it to build or you use it to destroy, but you never swing it wild. The moment you lose control, you lose everything. Oscar had been 15, fresh from a street fight where he'd broken another kid's jaw over a stolen jacket. He'd felt powerful in that moment, untouchable. Raphael had looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment. You think you won? You lost. You let him make you angry. Anger makes you stupid, and stupid gets you killed or caged. Remember this. The man who controls his temper controls the situation. Always. The lesson had taken years to truly absorb. Years of watching Raphael negotiate disputes that could have turned bloody. Years of seeing how quiet authority accomplished more than loud threats. Years of understanding that the most dangerous people in the room were often the calmest. By the time Oscar was 25, he'd internalized the code. By 30, he was enforcing it. By 40, he'd built an organization that ran on those principles: discipline over impulse, strategy over emotion, respect over fear. But there were lines, non-negotiable boundaries written in something deeper than rules. The powerful never prey on the powerless. Not in his presence, not ever. He'd learned that lesson differently. Not from Raphael, but from his mother. Elena Gimenez had worked 3 jobs to keep Oscar and his sister fed after their father disappeared. She'd cleaned houses during the day, waited tables at night, taken in sewing on weekends. Oscar remembered her hands perpetually raw, knuckles cracked, fingers moving with exhausted precision over fabric and dishes and mops. He remembered the men who'd assumed her desperation made her available. The manager who'd suggested certain favors might help with her hours. The landlord who'd let himself into their apartment with a bottle of wine and presumption. The customer who'd cornered her in a hallway and whispered promises wrapped in threats. She'd never told Oscar about them directly. He'd learned by listening through thin walls, by seeing her shoulders slump after certain shifts, by the way she'd started carrying a kitchen knife in her purse. At 16, he'd put 2 of those men in the hospital. Raphael had been furious not at the violence but at the lack of control. You think you protected her? You painted a target on your back. On hers. Think, boy. Think 3 moves ahead. But later, after the lecture, Raphael had pulled him aside. His voice had been different then, softer, carrying something that might have been approval. The reason matters, Oscar. Always remember why you move. Some lines, once crossed, demand an answer, but make sure the answer fits the question. Proportionate, precise, no collateral damage. Oscar had built his life on that balance. Controlled force applied at exact points of leverage. Never more than necessary. Never less than effective. Tonight, watching George Chaney's hand on Jennifer's wrist, he'd felt that old familiar calculation click into place. Not rage, not heroism, just the cold, mathematical certainty that this situation required intervention. The hands had been deliberate. No bruising grip, no dislocation, just pressure points that immobilized without injury. The proximity had been psychological, forcing George to confront the reality that money didn't make him untouchable, that there were still consequences he couldn't purchase his way out of. 11 seconds of contact. No more, no less. Proportionate, precise, controlled. But George's face, at the end, the flush of humiliation, the promise of retaliation told Oscar this wasn't finished. Men like George didn't absorb lessons. They nursed grudges and called lawyers. Oscar had expected that. Planned for it, even. Jennifer finally approached his booth, coffee pot in hand. Her movements were careful, professional, but he could see the tremor in her grip. Would you like a refill? Please. She poured, her eyes fixed on the cup. I don't know if I should thank you or apologize. Neither. He's going to come back, or send someone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He owns half this district. The manager won't protect me. Nobody will. Oscar met her eyes. They were dark brown, exhausted, and far too familiar with disappointment. Then quit. She laughed, the sound bitter. And work where? This is the 3rd diner I've tried. He has friends everywhere. Or lawyers. Or... She stopped, realizing she was talking to a stranger. Sorry, not your problem. Oscar considered her for a long moment. The yellow uniform, the tired eyes, the way she held herself like someone braced for the next hit. His mother's hands, cracked and raw. What's your name? Jennifer. Jennifer Coates. Jennifer. He kept his voice level. Matter of fact. Go home tonight. Come back tomorrow. Work your shift. If he returns, call the police. The police? She almost laughed again. You think they'll... Call them anyway. Create a record. Document everything. She stared at him. Confusion replacing fear. Why do you care? Oscar finished his coffee and stood, laying a 20 on the table for a $3 check. Because some lines shouldn't be crossed. And because you deserve better than learning to accept less. He walked toward the door, long coat shifting around him. "Wait," Jennifer called after him. "What's your name?" Oscar paused at the threshold, rain and neon spilling in from the street. He didn't turn around. "Just a customer," the door chimed as he left, swallowing him into the wet darkness. Behind him, Jennifer stood holding the $20 bill, feeling for the first time in years that maybe silence wasn't the only option. She had no idea that Oscar Gimenez was already 3 moves ahead, or that George Chaney had just made the worst miscalculation of his life. Jennifer's hands didn't stop shaking until she reached her apartment at 2:47 a.m. The building was one of those structures that pretended to be nicer than it was, fresh paint over water damage, new locks on doors that didn't quite hang straight. 4th floor, no elevator, rent that consumed 58% of her monthly income before utilities. She locked the door behind her, then checked it again, then a third time. The $20 bill sat in her apron pocket like evidence of something she couldn't quite name. She pulled it out, smoothed it against her kitchen counter, stared at it as if the faded face of Andrew Jackson might explain what had just happened. Just a customer. Jennifer had been serving customers for 9 years. She knew what just a customer looked like. They didn't move like Oscar Gimenez had moved, with that precise, economical certainty that made violence look like choreography. They didn't speak with voices that turned commands into statements of fact, and they definitely didn't leave $20 for $3 coffee. She made chamomile tea she wouldn't drink and sat at the small table by her window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below. The neon from the bodega sign across the way painted her walls in cycling colors: red, green, red, green. Her wrist still ached where George Chaney had grabbed her. It wasn't the first time. That was the part that made her stomach turn. Not the shock of it, but the familiarity. Jennifer Coates had learned about silence when she was 23 years old, working her first real job after college. She'd graduated with a degree in social work, $47,000 in student loans, and enough optimism to fill the gap between what she'd expected from life and what life actually offered. The position had been at a nonprofit downtown case manager for at-risk youth, salary just barely enough to cover rent and loan payments if she didn't eat out or get sick or have any kind of life. Her supervisor had been a man named Paul Richardson, 52, married, respected in the community. He had a way of standing too close during meetings, of letting his hand rest on her lower back when walking past, of scheduling one-on-one reviews that always ran late. She'd told herself she was imagining it. Then she'd told herself it wasn't that bad. Then she'd told herself that jobs like this were hard to find, and student loans didn't care about her comfort level. The night he'd cornered her in the file room, she'd finally understood the difference between discomfort and danger. "You're so tense," he'd said, hands on her shoulders. "Let me help you relax." She'd pushed past him. Gone home. Spent 3 hours staring at her laptop screen, cursor blinking in the search bar. What to do if your boss harasses you. The answers had been clear. Document everything. Report to HR. File a complaint. She'd done all 3. 2 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with the executive director. Paul was there too, looking appropriately concerned. He'd explained that Jennifer had misinterpreted friendly mentorship, that she seemed stressed, perhaps overwhelmed by the demands of the position, that maybe this wasn't the right fit for her. The executive director had nodded sympathetically. "These situations are so difficult. Perhaps a fresh start somewhere else would be best for everyone?" Jennifer had been gone within the month, terminated for performance issues that appeared in her file only after she'd complained. Paul Richardson still worked there, still mentored young women, still stood too close, and Jennifer had learned that silence was cheaper than speaking up. The tea went cold while she sat remembering. The neon cycled through its colors. Rain drummed against the window. Her phone buzzed. Text from Marie, the other night shift waitress. "You okay?" Heard what happened. Word traveled fast. The truck driver had probably talked, or the cook. By morning, everyone would know that Jennifer Coates had been grabbed by George Chaney, and some tattooed stranger had intervened. She typed back, "Fine, just tired." Another buzz. Marie again. "Bobby says to take tomorrow off if you need." Paid. Jennifer stared at the message. Bobby was the night manager, a decent guy trapped in middle management, trying to keep a failing diner afloat. The fact that he was offering paid leave meant he was worried. About liability, probably. About what George might do next. She should take it. Stay home. Let the situation cool down. Instead, she typed, "I'll be there. Regular shift." Because taking the day off was another form of silence. Another way of accepting that men like George Chaney got to decide when and where she existed. She thought about Oscar's words. Create a record. Document everything. Her laptop sat on the counter, closed. She opened it, the screen light harsh in the dark apartment, and pulled up a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Document everything. She began to type. Date: the 27th of December, 2025. Time: approximately 12:45 a.m. Location: Silver Spoon Diner. Incident: customer George Cheney grabbed my wrist and refused to release me when asked. He made inappropriate comments about my lack of respect and suggested I was ignoring him deliberately. Another customer intervened and Cheney left the premises. The words looked small on the screen. Inadequate. They didn't capture the feeling of his fingers digging into her skin, or the way her heart had hammered, or the shame of standing there while everyone else looked away. But they were something. A record. Evidence that this had happened. That she hadn't imagined it. That silence wasn't her only option. She saved the document, then opened her email and started a new message to the diner's corporate office. Her cursor blinked in the subject line. What did you even call this? Complaint? Incident report? Help? She settled on formal complaint, workplace safety concern, professional, unemotional, the kind of language that might actually get read instead of deleted. She described the incident in careful, measured terms. No drama, no accusations she couldn't prove. Just facts. Date, time, location, witnesses, physical contact, verbal statements. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was it. The moment where she chose whether to stay silent or speak up. She thought about Paul Richardson, still working, still mentoring. She thought about every hand that had grabbed, every comment she'd swallowed, every moment she'd convinced herself it wasn't worth the fight. She thought about Oscar Gimenez, standing up when everyone else looked away. You deserve better than learning to accept less. Jennifer hit send. The email whooshed into the void. No confirmation that anyone would read it. No guarantee that anything would change. Just her words, floating in corporate cyberspace, hoping to land somewhere that mattered. She closed the laptop and finally let herself cry. Not from fear, not from shame. From the exhausted relief of finally doing something instead of nothing. Outside, the rain continued. The neon cycled through its colors. The city slept or pretended to. And somewhere in a database, Jennifer's email sat waiting to be opened by someone who would either take it seriously or file it away with all the other complaints that never quite mattered enough. She didn't know yet that 3 other women had sent similar emails about George Cheney over the past 4 years. She didn't know that all 3 had been quietly settled with NDAs and money. She didn't know that this time, things would be different. Because this time, Oscar Gimenez was watching. George Cheney didn't go home after leaving the diner. He drove, fast at first, reckless, the kind of driving that came from rage looking for an outlet, then slower as the adrenaline burned off and calculation took over. By the time he pulled into the underground garage of his downtown high-rise, the humiliation had crystallized into something sharper: strategy. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave him time to smooth his hair, straighten his tie, rebuild the armor of control that the tattooed stranger had cracked. By the time he stepped into his apartment floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, his hands had stopped shaking. He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, then poured it down the sink. Clear head. That's what this required. George stood at the window, looking down at the city he'd spent 20 years learning to navigate. Not the city on maps or tourist brochures, but the real city, the invisible architecture of influence, debt, and leverage that determined who rose and who fell. He'd built his fortune understanding that architecture, buying struggling properties, evicting tenants just before neighborhoods gentrified, flipping buildings for triple their purchase price. It wasn't personal, it was math. Numbers on spreadsheets that translated into the penthouse apartment, the Italian suits, the car that cost more than his father had made in a lifetime. But the real power wasn't in the money. It was in knowing how to use it. The waitress, Jennifer, her name tag had read, was already forgotten as an individual. She was a variable now, a problem that needed solving with the same cold efficiency he applied to every other obstacle. The tattooed man was more interesting, more dangerous. George replayed the encounter in his mind, analyzing it the way he analyzed contracts. The man's posture had been too controlled, too precise, not a hot-headed hero looking for a fight. Something else. Something that suggested violence was a language he spoke fluently enough to choose silence instead. The grip on his hands had looked gentle, had felt like iron. George's stomach tightened at the memory not just of the physical restraint, but of the psychological dismantling. That quiet voice, those steady eyes, the absolute certainty that George's money, His influence, his carefully constructed power, meant nothing in that moment. It had been years since anyone had made him feel small. He hated it. And he would make sure it never happened again. George moved to his home office. Mahogany desk, leather chair, computers that connected him to every investment, every property, every angle he needed. He pulled up his contacts, started with the easy ones. First call, his lawyer, Richard Pemberton. 4 rings before the sleepy voice answered. George, it's 3 a.m. I need you to look into something. Silver Spoon Diner on 5th and Morrison. Who owns it? Who manages it? Full employee list by morning. A pause. What's this about? Incident with an employee. I want to know my exposure. Another pause. Longer this time. Richard had handled 3 previous incidents for George. Settlements, NDAs, problems that disappeared for the right price. George, we've talked about this. These situations keep happening and you keep fixing them. That's what I pay you for. Have the information by 8 a.m. He hung up before Richard could lecture him about patterns and liability. Second call. Mitchell Torres, property manager for his commercial holdings. This one went to voicemail. Mitchell, it's George. The diner on 5th and Morrison, I want to review the lease. Find out when it's up for renewal and what our options are for non-renewal. Also, employee files. Particularly anyone working night shift. Call me. Third call. Harold Vance, private investigator. Former cop, current contractor for people who needed information quietly. This one answered on the first ring. Mr. Cheney. Harold, I need you to look into someone. Male, early 40s, heavily tattooed, neck, hands, dark coat, probably 6'1", 6'2", was at the Silver Spoon Diner tonight around 12:45 a.m. Description's pretty vague, then check their security footage. I need to know who he is, where he works, what leverage exists. This is going to cost. I don't care what it costs. I want to know who I'm dealing with. He hung up and made 2 more calls. One to his business partner about pulling a city contract renewal. One to a councilman he'd donated to about zoning issues on 5th and Morrison. Not threats, just questions. Just reminders that George Cheney had long reach and longer memory. By 3:47 a.m., he'd set 6 different levers in motion. Not violence, not confrontation, just the slow, inevitable pressure of someone who understood that power in the modern world wasn't about muscles or guns. It was about knowing which buttons to push and having the patience to push them all. George finally sat down, exhaustion creeping in at the edges. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, expensive suit, silver hair, face that had learned to project authority in every boardroom and negotiation. But underneath, he could still feel it. The grip on his hands, the quiet voice, the moment when all his carefully constructed power had meant absolutely nothing. You have no idea what you just started, he thought, staring at his own reflection. That waitress? She's done. And you, whoever you are, you just made an enemy who knows how to destroy people without ever raising his voice. His phone buzzed. Text from Richard. Looked up the diner. Corporate owned, franchise operated. I'll have employee info by morning. George, please tell me you didn't touch anyone. George stared at the message. The careful lawyer speak. The implied warning. He typed back. Just get me the information. Another text. This one from Harold. Checking footage now. Preliminary search suggests your guy might have connections. Real ones. Be careful. George's jaw tightened. Connections was Harold's code for organized crime. So the tattooed stranger wasn't just a customer. He was someone, which meant this situation required even more care, more precision. But George had handled connected people before. Everyone had pressure points. Everyone had something they wanted to protect. You just had to find the right leverage and apply it correctly. He'd made a career of finding leverage. By morning, he'd have names, addresses, weak points. By next week, the waitress would be gone quietly, legally, with severance money and an NDA that made sure she never talked. And the tattooed stranger? George would decide that once he knew what he was dealing with, maybe a warning through proper channels, maybe a business complication, maybe just a long memory and patient revenge. That was the thing about power. Real power didn't need to announce itself. It just waited for the right moment and then crushed you so thoroughly you never even saw it coming. George finally allowed himself a smile. Cold, calculated. He'd been humiliated tonight. Embarrassed. Made to feel small in front of witnesses. But he'd had 20 years to perfect the art of making problems disappear. One tattooed stranger and a waitress who didn't know when to stay quiet, they'd disappear too. He just had to be patient. Outside his window, the city glittered with 1,000 lights, each one representing someone who thought they mattered. George had learned long ago that most of them were wrong. By morning, he'd start proving it again. Oscar Gimenez returned to the warehouse district at 3:15 a.m., his coat heavy with rain, his mind already calculating variables. The building didn't announce itself. No signs, no markings. Just a 3-story brick structure that had once housed textile manufacturing and now served purposes the city records didn't accurately reflect. Oscar owned it through a corporation that was owned by another corporation. Layers of legal distance that kept his name off anything that mattered. He took the service entrance, climbing stairs that echoed in the empty space, and emerged into what looked like a legitimate import-export office. Desks, computers, filing cabinets. During business hours, real employees did real work processing real shipments. But on the 3rd floor, behind a door that required 3 separate keys, was where Oscar actually conducted business. The room was sparse. A heavy wooden table, 6 chairs. A single window that overlooked the street below. No computers, those left trails. No phones, those could be tapped. Just paper, pens, and people who knew that words spoken here never left these walls. 2 men waited for him. Luis Cordero sat with his back to the wall, a habit formed during 15 years as Oscar's second-in-command. Early 50s, gray threading through his dark hair, hands that had built houses before they'd enforced territory. He looked up as Oscar entered. Trouble? Situation, Oscar corrected, hanging his wet coat on a hook. Different thing. The other man, younger, leaner, watched Oscar with the attentiveness of someone still proving himself. Tommy Ruiz, 28 years old, 3 years in the organization. Smart enough to listen more than he talked. Oscar sat at the head of the table. George Cheney, what do we know? Luis pulled a folder from his briefcase, the old-fashioned kind. Paper records that couldn't be hacked or traced. Real estate developer, 46 years old. Net worth estimated around 40 million, most of it in commercial properties. Politically connected, donated to the mayor's campaign. Sits on 2 city development boards. Criminal record? Clean. 3 civil settlements in the past 5 years, all sealed. Harold Vance does his investigation work. Oscar's eyes sharpened. Vance? The ex-cop? Same one. Works for clients who need things handled quietly. Tommy leaned forward. This about the diner? Word's already spreading. People are saying you grabbed some rich guy. I stopped him from harassing a waitress. Same thing to them. Tommy's voice carried the eager edge of someone who thought action was always the answer. You want us to send a message? Make it clear that, no. The word landed like a door closing. Tommy sat back. Luis watched Oscar carefully. You planning something? I'm planning nothing. Nothing? Tommy couldn't hide his confusion. Boss? If we don't respond, it looks like what? Oscar's voice remained calm, but the question carried weight. Like we're weak? Because we didn't beat up a real estate developer in a public diner? Tommy had the good sense to stay quiet. Oscar continued, his tone educational rather than angry. George Cheney is connected, wealthy, and probably already making calls. He's used to making problems disappear with lawyers and money. What he's not used to is people who think 3 moves ahead. So what's the play? Luis asked. We do nothing. Luis nodded slowly, understanding. Tommy still looked confused. Oscar explained, patience in his voice. Cheney thinks power works one way through pressure, leverage, money. He's already setting things in motion. Lawyers, investigators, probably pulling strings on the diner's lease or the waitress's employment. And we just let him? Tommy's frustration leaked through. We watch, we gather information, and we wait for him to make a mistake. What if he doesn't? Oscar's smile was cold. Men like George Cheney always make mistakes. They can't help themselves. Their whole life is built on the belief that money makes them untouchable, so they keep pushing, keep escalating, until they push against something that doesn't move. Luis pulled out a pen. What do you need? Everything on Cheney. Properties, business partners, political connections. Also quietly check if there have been other incidents, other women, other complaints that disappeared. You think there are? Men who grab waitresses in public don't start there. They escalate to there. Which means there's a history. Tommy finally understood. You're building a case. I'm collecting information. What happens with it depends on what we find. Luis made notes. This is going to take time. And if Cheney moves against the waitress or the diner while we're Then we respond proportionately. But we don't initiate. We don't escalate. We observe. The organization's going to hear about this, Luis said carefully. They'll have questions about why you intervened. Oscar had expected this. His reputation was built on discipline and control. Personal involvement in a public incident wasn't his style, and people would wonder why he deviated. Tell them the truth. A customer was being harassed. I intervened minimally. The situation ended without violence. And if they ask why you care about some waitress? Oscar was quiet for a moment, his mind going to places he rarely let it wander. His mother's raw hands, Elena's exhausted face, the way she'd tried to hide the bruises from the landlord who'd gotten aggressive when she'd rejected his advances. Tell them I have standards, he said finally. And those standards apply everywhere, not just when it's convenient. Luis nodded, understanding more than Oscar had said. Tommy spoke up, his tone different now, genuinely curious rather than challenging. Boss, can I ask something? Go ahead. You could have just walked away. Most people would have. Why didn't you? Oscar considered the question. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because putting it into words meant exposing something he usually kept buried. Because walking away makes you complicit, and I've spent 20 years building something that operates by rules. Real rules, not the kind that bend when it's inconvenient. If I can't stand up for those rules in a diner at midnight, then what's the point of any of it? The room fell quiet. Rain drummed against the window. Luis closed his folder. I'll have preliminary information by tomorrow evening. Deep background will take longer. Take the time. Do it right. Tommy stood. Anything else? Yes. No one from our organization goes near the diner, the waitress, or George Chaney. We observe only. No contact. Understood? Both men nodded. After they left, Oscar sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the rain-streaked window. Somewhere out there, George Chaney was making moves, pulling strings, applying pressure. He probably felt in control right now, confident. That confidence would be his undoing. Oscar had learned long ago that the most dangerous move was often no move at all. Let your opponent overextend. Let them make mistakes. Let them reveal themselves fully before you respond. Patience wasn't weakness. It was discipline, and discipline always won in the end. He thought about Jennifer Coates, probably lying awake in her apartment right now, wondering if she'd made things worse by filing a complaint, wondering if standing up had been worth it. It will be, Oscar thought, just not yet. He stood, put on his wet coat, and left the building through the same entrance he'd used to arrive. By morning, George Chaney would have names and addresses, but Oscar already had something better: time and the patience to use it. Jennifer's email sat in the Silver Spoon Diner corporate inbox for exactly 11 hours before anyone opened it. Sandra Walsh, regional HR manager for Delmont Food Services, arrived at her desk Monday morning with a grande latte and the expectation of another routine day processing vacation requests and uniform orders. She had 83 unread emails. Jennifer's was number 47. Sandra clicked it open, skimmed the first paragraph, then read it again more carefully. Her coffee went cold while she pulled up Jennifer's employment file, incident report protocols, and the legal department's direct line. By 10:15 a.m., Jennifer received a response. We take all safety concerns seriously. An investigator will contact you within 48 hours. Please document any further incidents. Professional. Neutral. The kind of response Jennifer had expected: acknowledgement without commitment. She was refilling salt shakers during the lunch rush when her phone buzzed with a different kind of message. Unknown number. This is Rachel Kim. I saw your complaint about George Chaney. We need to talk. Jennifer's hand stilled on the salt shaker. She glanced around the diner, Bobby at the register, Maria working the other section, the cook visible through the kitchen window. Normal lunch chaos. She stepped into the break room and typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. I worked at the Meridian Hotel downtown. Chaney was a regular. I filed a complaint 2 years ago. It went nowhere, but I kept records. Call me. A phone number followed. Jennifer stared at her screen, heart hammering. The break room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. She'd thought she was alone in this. She'd thought, another buzz. Different unknown number. My name is Lisa Pearson. I was a hostess at Bella Vista restaurant. George Chaney harassed me for 3 months before I quit. If you're building a case, I have emails. Jennifer's breath caught. Then another message. Emma Torres, executive assistant at Chaney Properties until last year. I signed an NDA, but I'll testify if it helps. What he did to you, he did to me. You're not alone. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 4 messages became 6. 6 became 9. Different women, different workplaces, different years, but the same story, repeated with minor variations. The inappropriate comments, the invasive touches, the casual entitlement of a man who'd learned that money made consequences disappear. Jennifer slid down the break room wall, phone clutched in both hands, reading message after message from women she'd never met who somehow knew exactly what she'd experienced. Bobby knocked on the door. Jennifer, you okay? Your section's filling up. I need, her voice cracked. Give me 5 minutes. Take 10, Maria's covering. She heard his footsteps retreat and forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her therapist had taught her when panic attacks made the world feel impossible. But this wasn't panic. This was something else entirely. This was possibility. By 2:30 p.m., Jennifer had 13 messages from women who'd encountered George Cheney. By 4 p.m., she'd called Rachel Kim back. Rachel's voice was steady, professional. I'm a paralegal now. I know how these things work. Corporate complaints get buried. NDAs keep people silent. And men like Cheney keep doing what they've always done because the system protects them. So why are you reaching out? Jennifer asked. Because the system only works when people stay isolated. When we think we're alone. But you filed a public complaint with a corporation that has liability concerns. That changes the math. How did you even know about my complaint? I have a friend in HR at Delmont. She can't officially tell me anything, but she can accidentally forward emails to the wrong address. A pause. We've been watching Cheney for 2 years, Jennifer. Collecting stories, building a pattern. We just needed someone willing to go first without an NDA. Jennifer's throat tightened. So I'm... What? The test case? You're the crack in the dam. Rachel's voice softened. I know that's not fair. I know you didn't ask for this. But you did something the rest of us couldn't. You spoke up without signing your silence away. He's going to come after me. Probably. He's already made calls. My source says his lawyer requested your employee file this morning. But here's the thing. If we coordinate, if we all come forward together, it's not one waitress's word against a developer. It's a pattern. And patterns are harder to dismiss. Jennifer looked through the break room door at the diner beyond. The worn booths, the neon lights, the life she'd built from scraps and stubbornness. What do you need from me? Permission to share your complaint with the others. And a meeting, all of us together, this week. Where? Rachel gave her an address. A law office on the east side. Thursday at 7 p.m. Attorney named Margaret Reeves. She works with employment discrimination cases, pro bono when the cause is right. And you think this is the right cause? I think George Cheney has gotten away with this for at least 5 years that we know of, probably longer. I think he believes he's untouchable. And I think 13 women saying the same thing might finally prove him wrong. Jennifer's hand tightened on her phone. Okay, I'll be there. After they hung up, Jennifer sat in the break room for another minute, staring at her phone. 13 women, 13 stories, years of silence, finally finding voice. Her shift ended at 6. She worked mechanically, her mind elsewhere. When she finally clocked out, Bobby pulled her aside. Corporate called. Said an investigator will be here Wednesday to take your statement. Okay. Jennifer. Bobby's face was troubled. Be careful. Cheney's already making noise. Called the franchise owner. Asked about lease terms. That's not a coincidence. I know. You can still drop this. File a police report instead. Let them handle it. Jennifer thought about the women who'd messaged her. The ones who'd quit their jobs, signed NDAs, disappeared into silence because standing up felt impossible. No, she said. I can't. Bobby nodded slowly. Then watch your back. And if you need anything, witnesses, statements, whatever, you let me know. After he left, Jennifer walked to her car through the parking lot, keys gripped between her fingers the way she'd learned in self-defense class. Every shadow felt threatening. Every engine starting made her flinch. But underneath the fear was something else. Something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed justice was automatic. The harder kind that understood justice required people willing to fight for it, even when fighting felt impossible. She got in her car, locked the doors, and sat for a moment in the silence. Her phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. This is Oscar, the man from the diner. You don't know me, but I'm watching. Cheney will move against you. When he does, Document everything. You're not alone in this. Jennifer stared at the message. How did he get her number? How did he know what was happening? More importantly, why did he care? She typed back. Who are you? The response came 30 seconds later. Someone who thinks some lines shouldn't be crossed. Thursday at 7. East Side Law Office. I know about the meeting. Go. Listen. But be careful leaving. Cheney might have you followed. The message ended there. No explanation. No signature. Jennifer's hands trembled as she started her car. 13 women finding their voice. One mysterious man watching from the shadows. And George Cheney, somewhere in his penthouse, still confident that money could make this disappear. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already started to shift. George Cheney sat in his attorney's office at 9 a.m. Tuesday morning, listening to Richard Pemberton explain why the situation was different. 3 previous settlements, George. All sealed, all with NDAs. But this waitress, Jennifer Coates, she filed with corporate HR before you could offer money. That creates a paper trail we can't erase. George's jaw tightened. So make her withdraw it. It doesn't work that way. Once it's in their system, Delmont has liability exposure. They have to investigate or risk a lawsuit for negligent supervision. Then we settle. Same as before. Richard removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Did you hear what I just said? This isn't like the hotel incident or the restaurant. Those women came to us privately. This one went official first, and... He pulled up something on his tablet. She's not alone. George leaned forward. Explain. Harold's preliminary report came in this morning. In the past 48 hours, at least 9 other women have contacted various attorneys about potential claims against you. Different workplaces, different years, but the pattern is identical. The room went cold. That's impossible. We had NDAs. NDAs only prevent people from speaking publicly about settlements. They don't prevent them from filing new complaints about new incidents. And if this becomes a pattern and practice case, Richard's voice dropped. George, we're not talking about nuisance settlements anymore. We're talking about potential criminal charges for serial harassment. George stood, walked to the window. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythms. Traffic, people, business, everything that had always felt under his control. Who's coordinating them? We don't know yet. Harold's working on it. But someone's been collecting stories, building a timeline. This isn't spontaneous. George's mind raced. The man from the diner, the one with the tattoos. What about him? Harold found anything? Richard consulted his tablet. Some. His name is Oscar Gimenez. He's connected. The word hung in the air. Connected how? The kind of connected where Harold strongly recommends we don't engage directly. Gimenez has no criminal record, but he's linked to several businesses that operate in gray areas. Import-export. Property management. The kind of portfolio that suggests organized crime involvement, even if nothing's been proven. George laughed, the sound bitter. So I'm being threatened by the mob? Not threatened. That's the strange part. Harold says Gimenez hasn't made any moves since the diner. No contact with Coates, no pressure on your businesses, nothing. He's just... watching. Watching, George repeated, which is somehow more concerning than if he'd done something overt. George turned back to the window. A week ago, his biggest problem had been deciding which property to flip next. Now he was dealing with coordinated complaints and mob surveillance. What do we do? Legally, we cooperate with Delmont's investigation. We settle whatever we can settle. And we prepare for the possibility that some of this becomes public. Practically? Richard's voice hardened. You stop. Completely. No more incidents. No more settlements. Because if one more woman comes forward while this is active, we won't be able to contain it. George's phone buzzed. Mitchell Torres, his property manager. I need to take this. Richard nodded. George stepped into the hallway. Mitchell, we have a problem. The Silver Spoon Diner, their lease is solid for another 18 months. I looked into early termination options, but the franchise owner has a lawyer now. A good one. They're threatening to sue if we try to force them out. Who's the lawyer? Margaret Reeves. She specializes in employment and tenant rights. The same name Harold had mentioned. The attorney coordinating the women. George's stomach tightened. How did a diner franchise afford Margaret Reeves? That's what I wanted to know. So I asked around. Apparently, she's taking it pro bono. Someone referred her. Who? Couldn't find out. But George. Mitchell's voice dropped. Word's getting around. I've had 3 calls this morning from business partners asking if the rumors about you are true. Someone's talking. Rumors about what, specifically? That you've been settling harassment claims. That there's a pattern. That women are coming forward. George closed his eyes. Who's spreading this? I don't know. But it's reaching the right or wrong people. The mayor's office called asking if we need to reschedule our lunch meeting next week. Very polite, very careful, but I know a distancing tactic when I hear one. After Mitchell hung up, George stood in the hallway, feeling the walls close in. His phone buzzed again. Harold Vance this time, calling instead of texting. Tell me you found something useful, George said. Depends on your definition of useful. Jimenez runs a tight operation. No obvious weak points. But I did find something interesting about the timing. Go on. The women coordinating against you? They started organizing 6 months ago, long before the diner incident. They've been building a case quietly, waiting for the right moment. What changed? You did. By grabbing that waitress in public, you gave them the opening they needed. Someone who filed an official complaint without an NDA. A crack in your armor. George's grip on his phone tightened. And Jimenez? Near as I can tell, he wasn't involved in the coordination. He just happened to be there that night. Wrong place, wrong time for you. Or, right place, right time. If someone knew I'd be there. Harold was quiet for a moment. You think you were set up? I think I don't believe in coincidences anymore. After the call ended, George returned to Richard's office. His attorney looked up, concern etched on his face. The mayor's office is distancing. Business partners are asking questions. And apparently the women have been organizing for months. Richard's expression darkened. Then this isn't reactive. It's strategic, which means someone's been planning this. The question is who? And why now? George thought about Oscar Jimenez, sitting quietly in that diner booth. About the controlled way he'd moved, the calculated precision of every action. About Harold's warning that he was connected. I want everything on Jimenez. Businesses, associates, properties, everything. George, Harold already said. I don't care what Harold said. Someone is coordinating this, and I want to know who. Richard stood. And when you find out? What then? You can't threaten him. You can't buy him off. Men like that don't respond to pressure the way you're used to. Then what do they respond to? Respect. Or fear. And you don't have enough of either. The words landed like a slap. George stared at his attorney, anger rising. I've spent 20 years building... Money, Richard interrupted. You've built money, which works on politicians and business partners and people who have something to lose. But Jimenez? He shook his head. You grabbed a waitress in his presence. You disrespected someone powerless in front of someone who's built a reputation on protecting the powerless. You didn't just make an enemy, George. You validated everything he already believed about men like you. So what do I do? Richard gathered his papers. You settle with every woman who'll accept money. You cooperate with every investigation. You apologize publicly if that's what it takes. And you pray that Jimenez decides you're not worth the trouble. And if he doesn't? Richard headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. Then you learn what it feels like when money can't save you. After he left, George stood alone in the office, surrounded by mahogany furniture and law degrees that suddenly felt meaningless. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Mr. Cheney. The voice was calm, measured. Oscar Jimenez. George's blood ran cold. How did you get this number? Same way I got everything else. I'm calling to give you a choice. Walk away from Jennifer Coates. Drop the pressure on the diner. Accept that what happened is finished. And if I don't, then we continue. And I promise you, the walls will keep closing until there's nowhere left to move. The line went dead. George stared at his phone, hands shaking with rage and something else. Fear. For the first time in 20 years, George Cheney was genuinely afraid. The meeting happened in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Margaret Reeves's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The conference table was scarred, the chairs mismatched, but the woman sitting at its head radiated the kind of competence that didn't need expensive furniture to prove itself. Jennifer arrived at 6:55 p.m. Thursday, her palms sweating despite the cold evening air. Other women were already there, some she recognized from their messages, others she'd never seen. 13 faces, 13 stories, all connected by one man's entitlement. Margaret stood as Jennifer entered. Miss Coates, thank you for coming. They shook hands. Margaret's grip was firm, professional. Everyone's here now. Margaret said, addressing the room. Let's begin. For the next hour, Jennifer listened to stories that mirrored her own with heartbreaking precision. Rachel Kim, the paralegal, described being cornered in a hotel elevator. Lisa Pearson recounted months of comments disguised as compliments. Emma Torres, the former executive assistant, detailed a pattern of inappropriate touches during business meetings. Each woman had documentation, emails, text messages, photographs of bruises, medical records from therapy sessions. Margaret laid it all out on the table like evidence in a trial that hadn't happened yet. Individually, these incidents could be dismissed as misunderstandings or he said she said situations. Together, they form an undeniable pattern of predatory behavior spanning at least 6 years. What happens now? Jennifer asked. Now we give George Cheney one opportunity to settle all claims simultaneously. Full compensation, public apology, agreement to attend counseling, and no NDAs. Everything transparent. He'll never agree to that, Emma said quietly. Probably not, which is why we're prepared to file a joint civil suit and coordinate with the DA's office on potential criminal charges. Margaret's expression hardened. He's been getting away with this because women stayed isolated. That ends today. The meeting continued for another hour, coordinating testimonies, establishing timelines, preparing for what came next. Jennifer was heading to her car when she noticed the man standing beneath the streetlight across from the building. Oscar Gimenez, long coat dark against the evening light, watching. She crossed the street. You're following me. I'm making sure you get home safely. Cheney has someone watching the building. Jennifer glanced around, suddenly aware of every shadow. Where? Gray sedan, half block down. He's been there since you arrived. Her stomach tightened. What do I do? Nothing dramatic. Get in your car, drive home normally. I'll make sure he doesn't follow. Why are you doing this? Oscar met her eyes. Because men like Cheney think they can do whatever they want to people like you. Someone needs to prove them wrong. You're not just some customer, are you? No. Should I be afraid of you? Oscar considered the question. That depends. Do you prey on people weaker than you? Of course not. Then you have nothing to fear from me. Jennifer studied his face, the tattoos, the steady eyes, the calm that seemed unshakable. The lawyer, the other women finding each other. All of this happening now. You arranged it, didn't you? I made some calls. Connected people who needed to be connected. The rest was them finding their own courage. Why? Because I could. And because no one else was going to. Jennifer felt tears threatening. Thank you. Oscar nodded once, then stepped back into the shadows. Go home, Jennifer. Lock your doors. Tomorrow Cheney will make his decision. She drove home as instructed, checking her rearview mirror constantly. The gray sedan tried to follow, but somehow got caught at a red light that Jennifer made it through. She never saw it again. That night, George Cheney received a package delivered by courier. Inside was a single folder containing copies of every complaint, every photograph, every piece of documentation the women had compiled, and a note in Margaret Reeves's letterhead. You have 48 hours to accept our settlement terms. After that, we file publicly and contact the district attorney's office. Choose wisely. George sat in his penthouse, the folder spread across his dining table, and finally understood what Oscar Gimenez had meant about walls closing in. Every threat he'd made, every string he'd pulled, every investigator he'd hired, none of it mattered. The women had documentation. They had coordination. They had legal representation willing to fight. And somewhere in the shadows, Oscar Gimenez was ensuring George couldn't make any of them disappear. His phone rang. Richard Pemberton, I just received a copy of the settlement terms. George, you need to take this seriously. I built my entire life. And you can lose it in a week if this goes public. 13 women, 6 years of documented harassment. The DA's office will pursue criminal charges. You'll lose everything. George looked out at the city he'd conquered through money and leverage. None of it felt solid anymore. What do I do? You settle. You apologize. You accept the consequences. Or you fight, and I promise you'll lose anyway, just more expensively and publicly. After the call ended, George sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in that diner booth. Oscar Gimenez had been right. The walls had closed in, and there was nowhere left to move. The settlement was signed on a rainy Monday afternoon in Margaret Reeves's conference room. George Cheney arrived with Richard Pemberton, and an expression that looked like he'd swallowed glass. 13 women sat on the opposite side of the table, silent and united. Margaret laid out the terms one final time. Full compensation for emotional distress and lost wages. Public statement acknowledging a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Mandatory counseling. And no non-disclosure agreements. Anyone here can speak freely about their experiences. George's pen hovered over the signature line. If you don't sign, Margaret continued, her voice level, we file in 48 hours. The DA's office is already reviewing the evidence for criminal charges. This is your last opportunity to maintain any control over the outcome. Richard leaned close, whispering urgently. George's jaw worked. Finally, he signed. The pen scratched across paper, and Jennifer watched a man who'd seemed untouchable reduced to just another name on legal documents. No dramatic collapse, no tearful apology, just the mechanical process of consequences finally arriving. When it was finished, George stood without a word and left with Richard trailing behind. The conference room exhaled collectively. It's done? Margaret said. You're all free to speak publicly if you choose. The settlement includes funds for continued counseling, and I'll be monitoring to ensure Chaney complies with all terms. Rachel Kim reached across the table and squeezed Jennifer's hand. You did this. You went first. We all did it, Jennifer corrected. After the others left, Margaret pulled Jennifer aside. You should know Oscar Gimenez made this possible. He connected me with sources, helped coordinate the investigation, ensured Chaney couldn't intimidate anyone. He never asked for recognition or payment. Where is he now? I don't know. He doesn't exactly leave forwarding addresses. Jennifer walked to her car through the parking garage, her footsteps echoing. The gray sedan was gone. The shadows felt empty rather than threatening. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. You did well. Some courage is quiet. Yours was the loudest kind. She typed back, thank you, for everything. No response came. Jennifer drove back to the Silver Spoon Diner for her evening shift. Bobby greeted her at the door with unusual formality. Corporate called. They want you to know your job is secure, and they're implementing new harassment protocols across all locations. Because they're afraid of lawsuits, Jennifer said. Maybe. But also because you made them pay attention. Bobby's expression softened. You okay? I'm getting there. The shift was normal. Coffee refills, orders taken, plates cleared. But Jennifer moved differently now, shoulders back, voice steady. She'd learned something crucial. Silence was a choice, not a requirement. Near midnight, the door chimed. Jennifer looked up automatically. Oscar Gimenez stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat. Their eyes met across the diner. He gave a single nod. Acknowledgement, respect, goodbye. Jennifer nodded back. Oscar turned and walked back into the rain-soaked night. She watched him go, understanding that some people save you without wanting credit, that justice doesn't always announce itself, and that courage sometimes looks like standing up when everyone else stays seated. George Chaney's public statement was released 2 days later, buried in local news. Professional language acknowledging inappropriate behavior and committing to personal growth. Most people never saw it, but the 13 women did, and they knew what it meant. Jennifer kept working at the Silver Spoon Diner. Not because she had to, but because she'd reclaimed the space. It was hers again, not George Chaney's, not anyone's but hers. And sometimes, on quiet nights when rain drummed against the windows and neon lights bled through the glass, she thought about the tattooed man who'd stood up when no one else would. Rain returned to the city on a Saturday night, 3 months after the settlement. Oscar Gimenez sat in the same booth at the Silver Spoon Diner, same black coffee cooling in the same ceramic cup. The neon lights painted familiar patterns across the chrome tables. Jennifer approached with the coffee pot. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, gratitude, understanding. Refill? She asked. Please. She poured, her hands steady. No tremor, no hesitation. The yellow uniform looked different on her now, or maybe she wore it differently. Quiet night, Oscar observed. They usually are this time. Jennifer set the pot down. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you really do it? All of it, not just that night, but everything after. Oscar looked out the rain-streaked window, considering his answer. My mother worked 3 jobs. Men like Chaney made her life harder because they could. I learned young that the world has 2 kinds of people, those who use power to take, and those who use it to protect. And you chose protect. I chose balance. Someone has to. Jennifer pulled out a chair and sat across from him, something she'd never have done before. The other women, the settlement, all of us finding our voices. That changed things. You changed things. I just made sure you had the space to do it. Is that what you do? Make space? Among other things, they sat in comfortable silence while rain drummed the windows. The diner hummed with its usual late-night sounds, the hiss of the grill, dishes clinking, tired conversation. He's gone, you know, Jennifer said. Cheney. Sold most of his properties, moved to another state. Word is no one wants to do business with him anymore. Oscar had heard. His network kept him informed. George Cheney had discovered that reputation, once destroyed, couldn't be bought back. And you? Oscar asked. How are you? Better. Therapy helps. Having people who believed me helps more. She paused. I'm enrolling in community college in January. Social work degree. Figured I might as well use what I learned. That's good. What about you? Do you ever stop watching for people who need help? Oscar smiled slightly. Old habits. Jennifer stood, picking up the coffee pot. Well, if you're going to keep watching, at least let me keep your coffee warm. Deal. She walked away to tend other tables, moving with confidence that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Oscar watched her work, satisfied with how the story had resolved, not perfectly. Cheney hadn't faced criminal charges. The settlement money couldn't undo years of harassment. But 13 women had found their voices. 1 man had faced consequences, and the balance had shifted even if only slightly. Oscar finished his coffee, left $20 on the table, and stood. Jennifer caught his eye from across the diner. She mouthed 2 words. Thank you. He nodded once and headed for the door. Outside, rain continued its relentless drumming. Neon lights reflected in puddles, painting the night in reds and blues. The city moved in its usual rhythms, indifferent, chaotic, alive. Oscar pulled his coat tighter and walked into the wet darkness, disappearing between buildings like smoke dispersing. Somewhere in the city, someone else needed help. Someone else was being pushed around by people who thought power meant permission. Someone else was learning that silence had costs, and Oscar Gimenez would be watching. Because justice didn't always wear a badge. Courage didn't always announce itself. Sometimes they just looked like one person standing up when everyone else stayed seated. The rain washed the streets clean. The neon lights continued their eternal cycle. And the Silver Spoon Diner remained open, a small pocket of warmth in the cold night. Inside, Jennifer Coates served coffee with steady hands and straight shoulders, no longer afraid. Outside, Oscar Gimenez walked alone through rain-soaked streets, a guardian in the shadows. And the city, indifferent and eternal, continued its restless dreaming. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.
Родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Понятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то, еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такое вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот, и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, к примеру, там, Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос, а кто ты без денег, он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку